Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. This webinar is a part of the Castro College Alabama Professional Development Webinar Series. Other topics that we've covered so far this year include the Alabama College Campaign, verification, completing the FAFSA for students and families with mixed immigration status, and a number of other topics. So we're excited to have you with us today. Castro College Alabama Professional Development Professional Development Webinar Series is managed by Alabama Possible, which is a statewide nonprofit organization that removes barriers to prosperity through collaboration, education, and advocacy. Today's webinar topic is guardianship and dependent status, which is something that we have heard time and time again from you, the educators from around Alabama, as something that you would like to see covered as a part of our webinar series. You know, guardianship and dependent status is something that shouldn't be complicated, but can sometimes be. My name is Colby Leopard. I'm the advocacy coordinator at Alabama Possible. And while we wait for a couple of other people to join, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll so that I can get a sense of who you are. So the poll should be appearing on your screen now. You'll be able to select the title that best describes your role in college access, as well as the part of the state that you represent. So Northeast, Southwest, Central Alabama. So I'm going to give a couple of seconds for others to join and for you an opportunity to fill out that poll. I'm seeing a couple of college access professional, career coach, North Alabama. Alabama Possible is located in Birmingham, so Central Alabama. So just another 5-10 seconds for people to put in their responses there, and I will share the results with the team. There we go. So I want to give a thank you to our sponsors today. This is all about collaboration, so we are grateful. And then I want to draw particular attention to UAB for being such a great partner in this college access work, specifically because our host today is a representative of the University of Alabama at Birmingham. So a couple of housekeeping notes before we dive into things. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will post it to our YouTube channel, which is /Alabama Possible, after it's completed. So I would encourage you to take a look and find it on our YouTube channel and share it with your colleagues. I'll also include the recording link as a part of our follow-up email after today's webinar. Second point, you are able to submit questions throughout today's webinar through two features. So we use a software called Zoom for our webinar series. It has some functionality where you can submit questions using the Q&A feature, which I'll be monitoring throughout the presentation, as well as the chat feature. So I'll be taking a look at both of those throughout the webinar. I will make sure that all the questions are answered. If some content I know is going to be covered in the next slide or something along those lines, I'll just wait for that to play out. Otherwise, I will either stop our host or hold the question until the end to make sure that we get those covered. Second, I mentioned earlier that today's webinar topic is an idea that came from you, the educators, and that's something that we really love to do, is address your concerns directly. So if you have an idea or a topic that you would like to see covered as a part of this professional development webinar series, please reach out to us. You can reach me via email or on the phone, and I will include this contact information in my follow-up email as well. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Laine Chapman. Laine works in the Office of Financial Aid at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. It's always great to have experts in the areas that we are talking about present on this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Laine.
Thanks so much, Colby. Let me get everything rocking and rolling here, and then we'll get started.
Great. Perfect. We can see you.
Excellent. So as Colby said, I know a lot of you probably have questions about dependency status and different things in regards to determining a student's status for the FAFSA and financial aid. So I want to cover a number of topics that we see commonly here at UAB, but I know that is seen commonly across the state and truly nationwide. So again, feel free to post any questions in the chat function or Q&A functions throughout the presentation, and I'll be happy to answer those as we go along or at the end as well. And of course, if we can't answer any questions while we're on the Zoom today, I'll be happy to follow up with you as well. So looking at dependency and just determining if a student is dependent or not, typically students will be considered a dependent student for financial aid purposes, and they will be provided to, or excuse me, they will be required to provide their parent information on the FAFSA. There are a few times when students will be considered independent, and you can see those below. So if a student is 24 years of age or older, which won't be the case for most of you as you're working with high school students, if they're married, if they're a veteran or on active duty, or if they have dependents that they provide more than half of the support for. Some students may have dependents, but they may not provide the majority of support for them, but otherwise they would be considered independent. If a student does not fit one of these categories, in most cases they will be considered a dependent student on the FAFSA. Now, of course, there are always special circumstances, and that's what I want to spend a majority of the time on today. So the FAFSA itself will ask students to indicate some of the items that you can see below, and they will do this right on the FAFSA as they're answering all of the questions about themselves and their income and their parents' information. So a student can indicate if they're an orphan, ward of the court, or in foster care. They can also indicate if they're an emancipated minor, have a legal guardian, or they are homeless or at the risk of being homeless. Students who do indicate one of these items will need to provide, of course, the necessary documentation for it. And if all of that comes through, then they will be classified as an independent student for financial aid purposes. Again, this is a little bit longer of a process because we will require some additional documentation at the school that they're looking to attend, but they will be considered an independent student. So taking a deeper look at these certain special circumstances, for a homeless student, if a student indicates they are homeless or at the risk of being homeless, they can be considered an independent student. This will populate an automatic requirement for students to submit some kind of supporting documentation to the school that they're looking to attend. Now that supporting documentation can come from a number of different resources. You as a school counselor can provide that, a clergy member, so a pastor or someone that they're involved in with in the community. A social worker can provide this information, or someone else who can provide documentation of their status as a homeless student, or again, at the risk of being homeless. Students who have a legal guardian can also be considered independent for financial aid purposes. The main thing to keep in mind with guardianship is that the guardianship must be permanent. If it's temporary, the student would still be considered dependent and would still need to provide their biological parents' information. If they are under a permanent guardianship, then the students will be required to provide that legal documentation confirming that status, and they will send that directly to the school that they're planning to attend. Now, of course, students may have some additional outstanding circumstances beyond those that are asked about on the FAFSA, and typically different colleges and universities will accept appeals for independent status for those special circumstances. And that can be a number of different items. If a student, it does feel like they fall into an outstanding circumstance, I always encourage them to reach out to the school that they're planning to attend to find out that school's process for considering students for independent status and to see what additional documentation they may need in order to be considered. Now, for those students who are considered dependent students, they must provide, of course, their parent information on the FAFSA, and that will be used to calculate their expected family contribution, or EFC. For dependent students, they do need to provide their biological or adoptive parents' information. Now, if parents are divorced, they will provide the information for the parent with whom they spend the majority of the year with. So if they're living with one parent, they will provide that parent's information. If that parent that they live with is remarried, they must also include the step parent's information, and that's regardless of if the step parent is providing for college or supporting the student in their college endeavors. If the parents are unmarried, but they are living within that same household, they must list both of their parents on the FAFSA. So those are just a few common circumstances as we're looking at submitting parent information. Now we get quite a few questions about what other information is required or who else's information is required. For the FAFSA and financial aid purposes, grandparents, foster parents, legal guardians, aunts, uncles are not considered parents unless the student has been legally adopted by them. Otherwise, they would not submit their information on the FAFSA. Now, I know that there are a few other common circumstances regarding either eligibility to submit the financial aid application or determining what information they need to submit. So U.S. citizens and eligible non-citizens are eligible for federal student aid and can submit the FAFSA, and they'll want to do that, of course, each year. I know many of you work closely with our DACA students. Unfortunately, these students are not eligible for federal student aid, but I do encourage them to reach out to the schools that they're interested in attending and also the states where those schools are located to see if there is any other aid available. Sometimes there is institutional or state aid that may be available to a DACA student, but unfortunately that federal financial aid will not be available to them. And then finally, students whose parents are not U.S. citizens or eligible non-citizens, these students can still submit a FAFSA, and they will still typically be considered dependent. They will submit their parental information just like any other student would, and their personal information, but many times these parents do not have social security numbers, so in that case, they would use all zeros for the FAFSA. So that covers just a few topics that we commonly hear about in regards to dependency status and in regards to what information needs to be submitted on the FAFSA. You can also see my contact information and Colby's contact information on this screen, but I'm happy now to start answering any questions you may have about what I've covered today or maybe what I haven't covered.
Thanks so much, Laine. And while we wait to see if there are any questions, and hopefully this was clear enough, I know that, like I said, this is a topic that we hear about regularly when communicating with counselors and career coaches around the state. But I think that this webinar did a really great job of demystifying some of the questions and some of the misconceptions perhaps around guardianship and dependency status. So I really do appreciate taking the time to go over that. And also, it isn't that complicated. So just maybe having a little bit of advice and hearing from the experts is, helpful to the partners that we have with Cash for College. So I'm just going to give it a little bit to see if we have any questions come in. So I've got one. What should a student do if a family member, not a parent, has custody of them and they are not in contact with their parents or parents refuse to provide information?
That's a great question, and that is one that we commonly receive. In that scenario, that is where the appeals application for independent status would need to be submitted, and the student would do that with the school that they're planning to attend. So for instance, if they were planning to attend UNC AP, they could reach out to our financial aid office. We have an appeals application that they can submit and provide documentation for. They'll also need to provide some supporting documentation from someone who's knowledgeable about their situation. So you as a school counselor could provide that. Again, somebody, a clergy member or a social worker, somebody who is working closely with the student and is knowledgeable. They can submit that supporting documentation as well. And then students can be considered for what we call a dependency override. So there is still a possibility that they can be considered an independent student, but it will require a little bit of documentation and typically some kind of appeals process. And that does vary school to school what that looks like.
Thank you. That was a really good question. So just going to give it a couple of more seconds to see if we have any additional questions, but I do want to remind everyone that, we don't have to answer all of the questions here. If you do have follow-up questions, please feel free to call either of us or shoot us an email. We're happy to answer any questions and any specific cases that you may have that you don't feel comfortable raising in this setting. So on that note, again, I want to thank Laine for joining us for today's webinar. Like I said, it's important that we actually bring in the experts in the areas that we cover. So really grateful for you joining us today, Laine. And I also want to say thank you to the educators that are participating in today's webinar. We would encourage you to take our follow-up email and forward the recording from today's webinar along to your colleagues so that they can also benefit from this excellent information around guardianship and dependent status. Please be on the lookout for that email as well as other information about upcoming Cash for College professional development webinars. And like I said, if you have a topic that you would like to have covered, it can be something specific or broad. We'd be happy to tackle that because it is our job, after all, to equip you with the tools and resources you need to have success in college access for your students. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.